Okay, so let's get started. So, hello everyone. My name is Sean Roberts. I'm the director of Open Data Initiative. We're focused on government financial transparency. I've been working in technology for about the last 20 years and open source projects for about the last 6. And transparency has really been a huge part of how I feel that the companies and projects I've been involved with have been successful. So I got involved with government transparency primarily because I wanted to get involved and try to help government with my tech background. And I wanted to get involved with people like you guys, experts that have been working in transparency for a number of years. Ohio has been recognized as a national leader, and obviously that's a great place for us to start and work with y'all and start seeing what we can do. So I wanted to introduce you guys, introduce myself already. So Greg Lawson, Buckeye Institute, welcome. Research
fellow.
Yes, sorry.
I've gone through a few different titles actually over the years at Buckeye, so that's my current title. So very good.
House Representative Mike Duffy, yep, sir, thank you for joining us. Frank Coastal, sorry. Deputy Director, Public Affairs.
Yes.
Right. Thank you for joining us. So we're here to talk about Ohio's push for open data legislation, and we're going to go through a general discussion about how you guys got here and what's next. Okay. So, to start off the discussion, I thought I'd ask you, starting off. So, what started the drive to publish government data in Ohio?
Great question, Sean. Well, thanks for having me and us. Happy to have you here in Ohio, and thank you for calling me an expert at financial transparency. I don't feel like it, but I'm trying to do the best I can for Treasurer Mandel, and that's who really has led the push in Ohio. He was elected in 2010, started in 2011 by Liberty Technology to make as much government information as possible for the people of Ohio. So what kind of started it was he saw the need for an increase in Ohio's ranking in the PIRG. I think it's one of the reasons why I went to you here was you came across that report. And 46th in the nation is terrible. It's nothing to hang your hat on. And so we began developing the state's checkbook site, and it's a local. And so the PIRG ranking is a big part of it, but we've got this really cool display, which maybe we can get to later, but the public distrust in government and the role of technology that it can play. So really just trying to give Ohio citizens as much information as possible, and the legislators as well, so that we can all make the most well-informed decisions.
Excellent. So anybody can jump in on these things. I'm just trying to go around and ask everyone something. So, Greg, how does the work drive down the cost of local governments in Ohio?
Well, I think one of the things we can't say enough nice things about what the treasurer has been doing. He's taken something. We started doing SAR databases, over a decade ago, and it was the effort to try to educate both policymakers and really grassroots folks about what the costs were. But it was a limited thing because it was only salaries, and we were limited to state and teachers and stuff because of the relative ease with which you were able to get the access. But when you started having to go to the local level, it was a whole other story. It was very time-consuming. We're a free market think tank. We don't have that many resources to be able to spend. You literally have to have somebody doing that nonstop to even get close, and really not even just one person because of the sheer number of local government bodies we have in the state of Ohio. And we felt though that is important. So that's why when the checkbook came online and when Treasurer Mandel started working so well to get that, it made sense to us. We're a big supporter of that conceptually because it's important. We are a group that believes in lower taxes, less regulations, allowing the market to work. That's important for job growth. There's a whole bunch of issues with Ohio and long-term job growth that we think are problematic. And one of the things that we need to be able to do is rein in the cost of government. And one of the best ways to do that is to educate people about it. I think a lot of times policymakers who don't dig into the weeds on that have there's sort of a general understanding, hey, government's too big, We need to do something, but where is it due? Where are the costs concentrated? Where are comparisons that can be made across different types of entities, whether it's at the state level or the local level? These are pieces of information that are technically kind of out there, but it's never been brought together seamlessly where they can look at it. And certainly when you look at local government and grassroots people who want to know that their local tax dollars are being spent well, it's very difficult for them to get it. When you got people who have to go and do public records requests to school boards, to the county commissioners, township trustees, city council folks, and who has the time to do that when you're just, somebody's trying to make good decisions or help be an engaged citizen. So we think that getting that information in the hands of folks will allow the government officials to be accountable. It will allow taxpayers to be able to look at those things, make educated decisions, ask educated questions. And what we hope for is that you can drive down the cost of government by empowering people through that information and the sum that is broad transparency.
It probably improves the quality of the questions as well. When they're initially asking the question as city council member, they actually can frame the question in a way that the city council member can actually respond rather than propagate that.
And Buckeye was smart to start with salaries because it's honestly it's the number one piece of requested information at any government level. People want to see what the government is paying for their employees, and it's one of the largest expenditures. So,
Have you guys seen the context of the jobs? The salaries go out there and people look at them, but is it difficult for people to grasp what actually these people are doing?
I'd say there isn't yet really a robust public conversation about labor costs or anything like that, even though the data is somewhat available, because it's still incredibly difficult to get to. I mean, part of what we're trying to do with open data is right now you're in a demand response system. So you, the citizen, demand data, the response has to come back. Can you imagine going on the Netflix today, and every time you wanted to watch a show, you click on the show, and somebody has to decide whether you're going to get that show and when you're going to get it. Like, it could be 2 weeks. I'm busy with paperwork.
Yeah.
So
I wouldn't fly.
open data means you're not waiting for somebody on the other end. It's just there. It's streamed. It's populated into the internet in a machine-readable online format.
Anticipating the question before and having the answer ready before somebody even thinks that they have the question.
Which, raises the question of open by default, I think is a really admirable goal for government to do, although if we try to boil the ocean, it can be overwhelming. And I think it will set the movement back if we ask state and local governments to do things that ultimately people don't find used and useful.
Mm-hmm.
And then they'll come back on us and they'll say, well, that whole thing, because there are a lot of people that are against transparency and they're just waiting for an excuse to say, well, that was never used. You wasted all your time putting that online.
That's a good point.
And I think that interestingly enough, even a little bit of that is the context and having the data and then being able to contextualize the data. One of the things, I was very glad we did it, the salary database, I think it's very important, but one of the things that I think even we have not yet been able to do as well as we like is to put that into a context so that people understand what does that actually mean. Because what's interesting is you don't want this, you want the information there, but it should be more than a voyeuristic kind of thing. And I can tell you, I've had people call at Buckeye Institute and say, look, I now live in Georgia, and my ex-spouse is not paying their child support. How much do they really make? And that's the kind of questions you get. And I mean, I'm not against somebody needing to find information like that, but that's not the general point there. You don't want it to be this voyeuristic, only niche thing. We need to have it where we can have some analytical capacity. We have to have the information in a way where when you pull it down at other organizations too, I think that's one of the things that President Duffy has been really trying to work on with Data Ohio is once you get the data out there and it's in a readable format, other organizations, groups like mine, but obviously not just the Buckeye Institute, will be able to then pull that data and then do something with it, right? Because it's the context and the way people interpret the information is going to be very important.
We need uniform taxonomies. So for accounting data, they call it uniform accounting standards, for example. Ohio once had that under a former Secretary of State before computers really existed, right? And we have not published since then a uniform accounting system. Now we have a uniform accounting network for townships. Some municipalities use it, some townships use it. They don't have to use it. We have 900, we haven't said this on the webcast so far today, but 900 plus cities in Ohio, 600 plus school districts, 1,300 plus townships.
Right.
We are a very local government heavy state. I think many other states that exist are going through this experience, being based 200 years ago on an agrarian society, and the distance of a township was the distance that you can go with a horse in one day to get to the market.
So actually, that's a really good segue because I wanted to get into Data Ohio, which is the meat and potatoes behind the legislation that I wanted to talk about. So, some success of getting legislation in the past, the House,
Right.
but it didn't get past
Right.
the Senate. So we're in that position again. It's past the House.
Not yet. It's past the House Finance Committee.
Finance Committee, thank you. So within the bill, there's a lot of details in the bill, but if I was to pull out one thing that makes it speaks the most to me is, and speaks to me most as an engineer that's worked on public projects, is leadership. And I see the definition of Data Ohio, which is this data board, if I was to generalize it, which is the leadership for open data within Ohio that you're proposing in the legislation.
Right.
So taking a small step back, so how do you see Data Ohio, the concept of the board, compared to the policy that was enabled by everyone working together to implement the policy? How do you see the data board itself being enacted in law? Why do you think that's important?
Right. So there's a lot of territorialism in state government, as Frank knows.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's really important, whatever we're doing, if it's a librarian function, if we're cataloging data, if we're providing data to the public, that it's not controlled by one political officer. And so the idea of shared governance is really important. It's very difficult in any state. You know, is it the legislature that's in control? Is it the executive branch? Is it which one of the 5 executive branch offices does it? All of these are partisan elected offices. So what we've tried to do is, through checks and balances, we've got a lot of different players, but a part of it, nobody has a majority of the seats. Nobody would even have close to majority of the seats. This is different than a lot of proposals that I think you might see for boards and commissions in the state of Ohio, in that most of them, the default is that the governor's office has at least half the seats or a slight majority of the seats, or is the de facto chair of that board or commission, and this is not structured that way. The way it's structured is they elect their own chair. And so whoever wants to be the leader of the Data Ohio board really has to be responsive to the entire constituency. Moreover, I think there's a tendency for people to put blinders on and think only about their data set, right? I mean, I wouldn't blame the treasurer's office if they're really focused on financial data. That's what they have access to. That's their bailiwick. That's their expertise. Secretary of State's office is going to be very focused on voter data. TAS is going to be very focused on procurement and state contracts. And so having everybody in the room allows them to debate what's the most used and useful data. And they can solicit input from the public. But what they're doing on an ongoing basis is streaming to the public standards for that data, which I like to think of as a lighthouse. There's many boats. They're all sailing right now. There's not really a direction for them. We're not going to, as a state, say to local governments or to state agencies, you have to sail in this direction. But we're going to put out a beacon, and we're going to say, you could do it this way. And as everyone moves towards that kind of gravitational center, you start to see economies of scale on software and everything else, because if you had 900 municipalities doing it the same way, it'd be very easy to provide value-add products to that customer.
If you started a state from scratch today, it would be easy, right?
Right,
Easy
right.
to standardize it right off the bat.
Well, to get back to kind of the uniform data, right? I mean, Representative Duffy talked about UAN, 90% of townships use it. I think 60% of the villages use it. We deal with the local government data every day, and I think the hardest would be the counties and cities to implement, just because they're so different. But UAN and schools, I mean, I think we're in a great spot now. I mean, if you go out, we've got almost close to 1,000 local government sites. There's a little bit of differences, which we'll get into later and show, what's the chart of accounts for a township look like for a village versus a library. It's really neat. I mean, we see it every day. But yeah, I mean, that's just the expense side. The revenue, the voter, I mean, there's all kinds of data that local governments have that.
And Greg was talking about the context on it. And so if I'm looking up salary data for a particular city on the Ohio checkbook, which is pretty easy to find that individually. What I also need to know is what is the employee staffing chart for that community and what's the taxonomy of defining. So if I want to compare, you know, your administrative expenses against another community's administrative expenses, which employees do I put in that bucket? Right? And who decides how you define them?
Right. And then, well, let me take a small step back on something we kind of talked about, but the leadership of let me say it this way: the structure of the Data Ohio Board as proposed in legislation. I think most people that get involved with writing something up, they want to write it up exactly like they think it should be. And I understand that desire. The problem is that, as you pointed out, not everyone's going to want to go in that direction. So the balance between just saying open data is good and go forth and make open data happen, between the other direction of going into super detail, how do you think the balance has been so far in the legislation that you have out there right now, and what do you think we could do perhaps to improve that?
From my perspective, it's chapter 1 hasn't even started yet. I mean, what we have in Ohio under a system of necessity and history, as the same as every other state, is financial data standardized. And that is what enabled the treasurer, Josh Mandel, to do Ohio Checkbook and to get perk number 1 was standardized data that existed through the OAK system, which is a large, multi-$100 million system that standardizes all of the transactions across the state. And so that data is available on a streaming basis that the treasurer's office can draw down and instantaneously populate on a machine automated basis. We do not have that for everything else. So staffing charts, as I was talking about previously, there's no way to stream that data right now. So when the Data Ohio Board is convened, if it's enacted into law, the first question is going to be, what is the most important fundamental first step that we need beyond financial data? And I think they're going to layer on financial data. I think their first conclusion will be, we need taxonomies of the data that already exists through Ohio Checkbook to enrich that data.
Okay. And so one of the things that's defined or outlined, better way of putting it, in the legislation is metadata. Quite often, my experience has been so far that when data sets are available, the beauties in the eye of the beholder, the creator of the data, especially the headers of the database or the spreadsheet. And they have a tendency to get rather specific. It means something to them, but typically to somebody else, it's very difficult. So how success? What do you think success would look like for managing, not only standardizing the accounting systems, but standardizing on metadata throughout the administrative state as well as the cities? It's kind of a big, broad question.
Well, I think one of the neat features about the state's checkbook is how it makes a lot of that metadata digestible, right? You click on a chart, you start an agency, it breaks it down to expense categories. You click on a category, it goes into subcategories and sub-objects. So it takes the user down through the information in a way that you understand it. I think that's one of the really fallbacks with a lot of other transparency initiatives, programs around the country is, Socrata's got a great, data site. Well, it hanging those big files out there, it's not digestible to the common user, and how to incorporate graphs, charts, benchmarks, comparability. You have to have these features that really uses the information so you can read it and digest it. I mean, metadata, we're talking, there's all kinds of billion information out there, right? But it's how can you package it up to make it, publicly available and easily digestible.
Do you think that, I'm not 100% sure how, when a bill comes from the House to the Senate, if it gets changed, how that process would work?
So if the House bill is changed in the Senate, it has to come back to the House for concurrence.
Okay.
It does not have to go through committee again in the House, but we just have to agree to the changes in the Senate. If we don't agree, then it goes to conference committee and we try to work out the differences, and then it'll go to a final. But hopefully you would just do it increments at that point if you have a good collaborative relationship. And to go to your point about defining what success is, I think it's important that in the early years, as we do it, that each step on the open data effort kind of pays for itself in some tangible or perhaps intangible but publicly recognized kind of way. For example, if you can standardize data in such a way that it would support the creation of a small tech startup industry, right? It's open data. Anybody can do it. It's not going to benefit one particular company. Everyone kind of has free reign to go after it. But there's a company out of Cleveland called Streamlink, and federal standardization of data is important to them. The federal government wants to increase grant compliance for money that flows through to local nonprofits, right? A lot of that flows through the state. So as the federal government seeks automation so that they can reduce their costs in conducting oversight, there's an opportunity for companies like Streamlink to create the software to make that cheaper. It's the TurboTax for federal grant compliance, right? Well, that entire enterprise was not possible without standardized, machine-readable, open data that's streamed on a constant basis. And if that exists, then the first to do it and to get that market share becomes the job creator, right? And that can happen anywhere. So the idea of a state like Ohio being ahead of other states is in some sense, if you can build the feedstock, which is open data, for all these startups to occur and to create the value add on top of it. The public data itself can't be charged for, but everyone else can enter that market and start competing. And it starts to lower our costs to us to comply with other things. Take, for example, local governments in Ohio every year or 2 years have to do a financial audit with the state auditor's office. They can hire their own auditor, they can go through the state of Ohio. If they go through the state of Ohio, I think it's like $40 or $50 an hour to hire the state auditor to do your books. Right? Well, if you have standardized data and they're not wading through a financial report that's different than in other communities, they can squeeze down the amount of time that it takes them, which means your out-of-pocket cost goes down. Right? You might go from paying $40,000 for an audit down to $20,000, and that's every year, and it starts to add up over 1,300 townships, 900 municipalities.
We hear that a lot with UAN entities. Hey, if we join the checkbook, does this mean our audits get to go down?
Right.
It's a great idea. Please bring it up to the state auditor's office.
Right.
But I mean, we've heard that, I mean, hundreds of times, I mean, throughout the couple of years now. Schools too, I mean, that's a big cost that it's just given to them. Hey, here's your bill. You know, sometimes you're getting the CPA or an auditor of Marietta that's on the books somewhere in Northwest Ohio. So just the logistics is tough, getting documentations and stuff. It's all online. Makes it a heck of a lot easier.
Right. I think interestingly enough too, I like what Duffy is saying, particularly about the capacity to marketize some of this stuff. The data obviously is free, could be free, because it's available to everybody. And value add and being able to put things in there. I mean, the ability for us to be able to do deeper research and understand where governments can find better efficiencies, you know, or you know, a lot of local government is the right number of local. I mean, these are serious research questions, right? But being able to get to the nut of those questions means being able to access stuff that you can then, of course, that benchmark across multiple jurisdictions. But I can also see universities engaging in this, the opportunity for finding niche market opportunities in different parts of the state to be able to look at what are the costs of the various states that you have there. So it's the ability to then package that material that's so important. And I think that one of the great things there is that the ability to take that information and then do that value add, and that becomes something that's then subsequently marketable to be an income-based thing. Great for startups, great potentially for already existing businesses. That's a good opportunity for universities and research facilities and things like that as well. So just again, getting that access point and standardization and doing it because you know, one small example, not to belabor too much, is we have a little bit of this with education with a couple of things, where you have the ability to look at similar districts as defined by the Department of Education. So you can look at some of the cost structure or some of the basic top tier data. You can look at different school districts, but you have to have it defined in such a way that you can make meaningful comparisons. Making comparisons between Columbus, Ohio, and Marion is not going to be a whole lot of good. The cost structure is completely different. And so inching towards. And I think to the extent that as the data Iowa board, once it's convened, is able to start doing that so we can put together that information. It's so critical for what we do at Buckeye. It's going to be so critical, I think, for tons of marketing, tons of other types of businesses.
Yeah, we've already had some evidence. I recall a superintendent calling in, and they had a job applicant who said she got paid X amount at her previous district, and he called and said, "Hey, I know you guys have a salary database. Could you help me find it?" Just kind of doing his due diligence. We've had technology companies say, "Hey, we've actually used your guys' checkbooks to see what cities and counties are using for their IT, and how much they're paying." A big, I guess, we'll say task for local governments, but a common occurrence are these procurement and fulfillment centers that will call in the local governments once, twice, maybe 3 times a year. "Hey, give me all of your vendors that you used." And now if they participate in the checkbook, they're actually not bothering the local governments anymore. They're just going online and pulling down the raw data. So it's starting to save local governments time. Public records requests, of course, the records publicly available online 24/7. Hopefully it's going to save the government time to answer some of those requests. They can just, hey, all that stuff's online.
I think one of the challenges of open data is to think about it in the sense that the way email was to U.S. postal mail and the conventional communication methods, fax and whatnot that we had before email, and to think about open data partially as public records law, and many of the attacks against public records law are similar as the attacks against open data. They say, well, who needs that? When's it going to be used? Why is that law even necessary at all? Is it really saving people time? I think we could argue the frequency of communication has gone up under email. I think universally we all say that it saves us time. Right? It may be that we're putting more time into the process as a result. I think a lot of that creates a value. Can you quantify? It's not easy to quantify. And so I think people are kind of like, well, this is not useful because we don't know what it means. Well, would you have known what the value of the internet was if somebody said, we're going to create the internet and it's going to be this thing that you're going to go to, and they would go, who's going to use that? Like, you don't know that you need it until you've lived it for a while. And I feel kind of we're at that stage a little bit right now with open data is, why do I need an iPhone? Why do I need that? I have a phone. It works just fine.
Play work with friends.
Right.
That's why you need it.
No, we hear that all the time in local governments. And in fact, kind of the progression of the local initiative was we had a large kind of positive response when we announced it. But that's, in a new technology developer, that's usually a pretty small part. Your next kind of, I think it's the leaders, and then I think it's the majority that come in, they say they wait, they say, well, I don't want the iWatch yet, it just came out. I'm gonna wait until 5 of my friends get it, ask them how it's working, and then maybe I'll get one. And that's kind of what we've seen with the local government checkbooks is a lot of folks just said, hey, I don't want to jump in yet. Kudos to the ones that did, if you guys are out there watching. A lot of counties, a lot of cities, a lot of schools, but now it's getting to the point where, hey, I've got 4 school districts on around me, I'm gonna check in with them, make sure it hasn't increased public records requests, make sure it hasn't increased, a negative community engagement, and it hasn't. So I think we're starting to see that evidence, which will help. I think local governments, succumb to this idea of getting this information out there and making it publicly available.
One thing that I think is going to be driving this, like with or without our legislation that's happening in all 50 states, is that increasingly the national investment market, particularly the bond market, the bond investor market, is demanding
Financial
disclosures and data. And there's a huge amount of costs. Attorneys are going to look up a lot of the data that exists at the county, local level to make sure that they can find out what is the bond rating of this community and what's their interest rate going to be on the bond that they issue. And so I think municipalities are coming around and other local governments coming around to the idea that we have to reduce that cost process so that we can get access to the capital that we need on the bond market to be able to build a new rec center or whatever it is that we're trying to do.
Yeah, we work with local governments a lot. We've got a program called OMAP, it's the Ohio Market Access Program. All these smaller governments might have a credit rating, kind of think that in states. One of the big thing is financial disclosure, and if they have a website and they don't have any information out there, well, where is this information? So it helps having a website, having budgets and CAFRs out there. But when we talk about open data, is it machine readable? You know, how digestible is it? So that's a tough one because as we've seen with 88 counties in Ohio, I think 13 or 14 of them up until this year didn't have an ERP system that was able to export to Excel. So just think about that. They don't have access to their information in a really manageable way. And so, you know, local governments can be tough. But
Not to be overly negative about it, but I remember doing a project. I was reaching out to townships, and I had a couple of yellow pads come in.
yeah,
And on a breakage request to a township, yellow, handwritten
yeah,
on a yellow pad. I may have even had one that was not even as nice as a yellow pad. I think I had one that was on like an even smaller piece of paper with almost like scrap paper and stuff like that. Ostensibly because they didn't have the spreadsheet stuff. And, you know, I'm hopeful that that's not, you know, and of course the other favorite one is with a PDF, spreadsheets. They send you the PDF, not the actual, you know, the spreadsheet. So you can't do anything with it because you got a PDF and do that. So, you know, but my favorites are the yellow pads because it really has happened. And it's really kind of weird when you think about it. But that was what I got for a public records request. I think I still got it in my
And that, how frustrating must be to work in an office where you can't actually get the data out of the system, much less communicate it to you.
I think it's in somebody's garage.
And it's frustrating to the public office that's trying to comply because they're not trained to do that. They've always done it the way that they've always done it. They view their job as their internal constituency, not somebody that's in another part of the state that wants to know what's going on in their community for benchmarking purposes. And so I think, you know, our ability to be successful is partially predicated on the permissive nature of this, that if you have the township fiscal officer who's been doing it the same way for 40 years on a yellow pad, and that's the way they want to comply, should you force them and then create an uproar and then they fight open data? Or should you say, hey, when you're ready, you're ready. And then the next guy comes along, they're fresh out of college, they're very fluent in Excel, right? And you say, we've got a standard that you can use. You can come up with your own way to do it, or you could use the standardized way that a third of the jurisdictions across the state of Ohio are already doing. Right? And suddenly everyone starts to coalesce. It would be a generational thing. It's not going to happen within 5 years. It's going to take years to get to kind of age into place and everyone to get comfortable with that. One of the other complaints that we get is, and I kind of feel like Greg's example kind of alludes to this. Somebody would say, well, I don't have the resources to buy new software, to learn something complicated or all that. But I think it's incredible how many free spreadsheet type tools exist. Like even Google Sheets could be the way that somebody would comply with this, as long as the rows and columns are defined appropriately and there's some effort to do that. But right now, if you said to one jurisdiction, well, how am I going to do that? They would go, I don't know. Another jurisdiction is going to be the one to come up with a standard for everybody, and would they follow that? They get, you know, it's like my son Jack is 7 years old. Tell him that his sister Annie is going to decide how they're going to play the game. Like, he's not going to do it.
So, better communication between agencies and constituents, lower costs through competition and standardization,
building trust.
building trust with the public and voters. These all sound like wins. Of course, these all require momentum. And I think definitely Ohio has momentum right now. Being recognized as a leader certainly, I think, helps in having other states even come to you for asking for help, which has been happening, which is impressive. So I want to close out with asking each one of you if you had to boil down one recommendation or one thing to another state or another city, probably state is a better example, what would it be?
We kind of alluded to it earlier, but one of the things that made the Ohio checkbook so successful was Ohio in 2008 kind of homogenized all the department ERP systems, and we had this uniform chart of accounts we implemented, and that gave us the ability to pull in that raw data that we were then able to identify what piece of information we wanted. It was important that we could track revenue sources, try to get as many pieces of data associated with each payment, which at state is like over 30. It doesn't exist at the local level. They don't have that level of chart of accounts. But really, I mean, having that supply source, I mean, is what made it not easy, because it wasn't easy, building the state's checkbook, but easier was having that good data source. And same with local governments. So local governments, having a good financial accounting system, having good help, makes it a heck of a lot easier to spit out some spreadsheets that then we're able to, help make more digestible and give these local governments a tool to effectively communicate, build trust, and to use.
So to start in the back office.
Yeah, and you guys do a good job at your best practices on your guys' website. What are the goals set out by this? We wanted to make it easily accessible. One website, ohiocheckbook.com. We want to make it searchable. That's a big thing. A lot of states have been just putting out PDFs or just 100,000 row spreadsheets, and that's not really searchable. Control F, we get you some keywords and digits, but having that Google style search bar, and then making it really interactive. So having charts where, again, you click an agency and it goes through the breakdown, so it leads people, it shows people the information in a way that they can understand.
I think it's important to think about the fact that we are the lobbyists for good government. Good government usually does not have some $12,000 a month retainer lobbyist with a large political action committee that's advocating for it. And that's what we're up against in state houses all across the country. Is the focus is so much on all those issues that are being brought to the legislature on a responsive basis, and it sucks up all the oxygen in the room. And so if you want open data to move ahead, you have to fight for it, and you have to band together as a coalition. For example, in Ohio, I think we've had many allies, but there hasn't been a particular umbrella to push it all cohesively together. So the Ohio Newspaper Association has always been very supportive, editorials and those kinds of things. We've had Buckeye and others that have been supportive. We've had National Data Transparency Coalition, we have Open Data Institute. They're all supportive, but there isn't something to necessarily bring it all together and to make it a big push. And so if you don't have that advocacy component, then you rely on the political will of one individual, which we were lucky and very fortunate in Ohio. The treasurer, Josh Mandel, had the political will to do this. And it started a conversation that now is going to help my legislation, frankly, which is to say, something happened, we got a PIRG #1 award, people are paying attention to us, and that attention makes the coalition a little bit stronger and makes people pay attention to the issue.
Good leadership makes good policy,
Correct.
which should follow into law.
I think I'd like to say that one of the things to do is that we want to make your life actually better and easier for you too, whether it's the state or local governments. Because one of the things that I think happens is groups like mine, we're doing it for the right reasons, but we can be quite a pain in somebody's rear end if we need to be.